And we are live. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. Before we kick off, just some light introductions. For those that perhaps we haven't met before, my name is Nathan, and I'm co founder of Quickfire Digital, an e commerce focused web development agency, primarily working with Shopify and Shopify Plus. Now, I'm delighted to be able to introduce my co host and business inspiration, Heloise Finch from Sell Beyond. Heloise, please tell us a little bit more about Sell Beyond.
Hi, I'm Heloise Finch, founder of Sell Beyond. We're a management consultancy which helps brands build a better Amazon business, focusing on marketing, operations, and organizational behavior.
Wonderful. Now, thank you. And on to today's guest, a man that really should need no introduction. We're delighted to welcome Carl Monk, who is Director of Insight at the British Retail Consortium. That's an organisation which works with the UK's retail sector and the government to leverage data and report on industry trends. So, good morning, Carl. Thank you for joining us.
Morning, both. Thank you for having me.
Carl, let's begin with telling us and the audience a little about yourself and the fascinating work that you guys get up to over at the British Retail Consortium.
Sure. So I'm Kyle Monk. I'm Director of Insight at the British Retail Consortium, sit on the leadership team with the other policy and comms directors. And essentially, we are with the trade body and sort of lobby group for retail. So we are the link between government and retail, but we also offer advisory to retail and sort of the constellation of suppliers that work with them. So we represent, I think, about 80% of the sector by turnover. So all your big grocers, non-food, pure plays, you name it. And actually, our definition of retail is more than just sort of brands selling other brands. It's, we have the likes of McDonald's, Starbucks, we've got D2C companies, FMCG. So it really is any sort of company that sells into consumer markets. So yeah, I've been there about 3 years, worked in retail for 10 years. And day to day, we essentially build a lot of the benchmarks for the retail sector. So we collect turnover from our members, we collect footfall from our partners at ShopperTrack, we measure pricing, and we've got lots of touch points on a bi-weekly basis. We sit with CEOs and talk about the sort of issues of the day and feed that back to government and through to the public, through the media, to sort of help build a better environment for retail to thrive.
Oh, that's amazing. And just a bit of housekeeping for those that are joining us today. Please do ask your questions as we go. Heloise and I have collected some questions that we'll be asking Carl throughout today's session. But if you do have something that crops up, please do put it in the comments and we will do our best to come to it as quickly as possible. And so, Heloise, let's kickstart today's session. Once again, Carl, thanks for joining us. Heloise, over to you for the first question.
Kyle, thanks for joining us. Really big question. What state is UK retail in right now? Where do you see consumer confidence going?
So there's a really big question, and there's been some really wild swings depending on when you ask me that question over the last 18 months. But it's not in the worst place that it's been, if I'm being honest. So Christmas performance was generally better than anticipated, despite Omicron, despite people sort of voluntarily sort of going out less to stores because of the rising case numbers and the uncertainty around how bad Omicron would be. Overall sales were actually positive for the month. In terms of consumer confidence, it declined a little bit in the last quarter of the year, but it's actually, if you look at January, which I think was -19, it was -28 that time a year ago. So we've seen a sort of slow recovery. The successful vaccine rollout, the booster program, the fact that Omicron seems to be less sort of virulent than perhaps previous strains and less deadly, have all been a sort of positive contributor to retail. And obviously throughout this, retail's been very resilient. Hundreds of millions have been spent on sort of protective equipment for their staff, on perspex screens, on sort of policies and operational strategies that help keep consumers safe and not sort of lift the R number despite essential retail being open throughout. So, we're still facing significant challenges, which I can come on to in a little bit, but we've seen, at least for, the grocers, it's no secret, have had a very good pandemic. Sort of essential retail being safe message landed, and consumers are very comfortable still doing their grocery shops. Non-food's been very mixed, and we saw some very steep declines across a lot of categories, what you might call social categories like footwear, fashion, and although they're doing better than they were, they still haven't recouped the losses that they had accrued in the first sort of 2 to 3 lockdowns. Other categories, so home-centric categories, as we call them, so your electronics, home appliances, white goods, DIY have all been sailing. So furniture sales in Q1 were up something like 40% year on year. And that's a product of people having to spend more time at home, working from home more. and sort of investing in those items. So mixed year, but we're sort of entering into 2022 with some green shoots.
Very good. Kyle, I've been learning about a new term called Generation Alpha, and I've never come across GenAlpha before. But for those listening today, I'm interested to see how retail brands are considering adopting their advertising and marketing to better promote their brands to the kind of Gen Z and Gen Alpha, especially as we start looking at Web 3.0 and the metaverse.
It's a very good question. I think, generational change is inevitable. And I was moderating a panel at the Internet Retail Expo last year, and there was a Gen Z, which was at the time, I think Alpha's perhaps introduced since then, but we were asking them questions around, how they perceive companies, what was important to them in terms of messaging. And the sort of things that came out of that were mainly authenticity. So it's, the sort of rules that worked for advertising before don't necessarily work on the generations coming through now. They're much more savvy to actually the sort of tricks of the trade when it comes to marketing and so the sort of psychology and behaviors behind it. So authenticity, not doing something for the sake of doing something. So, getting an influencer in because you think that's what that demographic want, who isn't really briefed and will just, sort of sell your product quite flatly. It's about forming connections that are sort of mutually beneficial, that sort of actually resonate and are genuine, which is incredibly challenging. But the companies that have got it right are doing incredibly well. And interestingly, when asked, this sort of Gen Z group were, what their favorite brands were, they named 5 or 6. And it's my job to be quite well versed in retail, but I actually hadn't heard of half of them. So there are a lot of disruptors coming in, marketing in a very different way through social, but in a sort of organic and sort of authentic way, which are sort of gaining market share in these segments. So it's difficult for like larger legacy brands to sort of tap into that in a meaningful way, but it isn't impossible.
Thanks for that, Kyle. The one retail challenge that some of the people that sent in questions wanted to know more about is multi-channel retail. That's replicating e-commerce journeys on other channels that consumers use the most. What are your thoughts about this challenge for retailers today?
So I was once told by someone very senior at Made that we live in a post-channel world, but omnichannel still is the term that is used. I think digital works best as a tool when it's seamless and it's not sort of distinct from the other experience. So you've got companies that do it really well. So I think Starbucks and their sort of app where you can pre-order or do takeaway from the store, you can earn points, you can browse menus before you go. Things like that have had huge success, and I've seen the companies adopt them grow massively. You've seen during the pandemic, companies that have traditionally just been bricks and mortar, like IKEA, rapidly spin up online operations to sort of mitigate non-essential store closures. So I think we're going into a world where online penetration is significantly higher than where it was before. So I think for non-food, it was around 30 pre-pandemic. It's now stabilized at around 40, even at the height of recovery when everything was open. And people are generally just visiting stores less. So, and when they do, they're sort of making more purposeful journeys. So they're going to specifically get something, and that sort of diffuse browsing shopper mission is becoming less and less common as people sort of have to carefully calculate for health reasons, whether or not they want to leave the house or not. I think hybrid working is here to stay. So all those factors mean that people have to very carefully think about their online proposition and how you replicate things that are the best in store. Beauty still only about 15 to 20% of online sales, even at the height of lockdown, were made in stores because people just they'll defer the spend and they'll buy their beauty products at a later date because they prefer to try them on, get shading right, all the rest of it. So there are ways to get around that, and there's companies doing online color pickers now and sort of sample kits to sort of test before you buy. So there's lots of different strategies, but there's not like a golden rule yet on how that works.
Could you repeat what that large company said? What's dead? Channels dead?
Yeah, yes. So the question was around omnichannel, and she said, well, at I think it was Made, they said, well, we live in a post-channel world, and actually companies that think in terms of digital and offline are sort of already a step behind. So really, it should be when you're thinking about these things, they should be holistic. The strategy should be singular, and both should complement each other in a seamless way.
That's really helpful. Thank you. I'm just going to put that on for the chat so people can see.
Those that are watching again, please do feel free to ask your questions as we go through. Just put them in the comments and we'll be happy to answer them. Carl, I was in London last weekend and I was fascinated to see how high street stores are trying to keep up with the evolving consumer demands, whether that be iPads in store to kind of check stock quantities or maybe see variations of product. How are you seeing high streets adapt to the ever-changing kind of consumer demands? And do you think we'll see footfall as it was pre-pandemic, or is that now a thing of the past?
It's really tricky. So, I mean, footfall for most location types has been on aggregate around 20% down from where it was pre-pandemic, and has never really gone above that since since the pandemic began. Different types like retail parks recovered to more or less pre-pandemic levels. Shopping centers probably faring the worst, and high streets or somewhere in between. There are things that stores can do. Pre-pandemic, we were talking about experience and broadening the use cases of stores. So bringing in events and speakers and sort of giving people a reason to go to those stores. And Oxford Street, I don't know if that's where you were visiting, but the sort of flagships do it very well, where they launch little collections that you can only get in that particular store, or they'll have sort of shop in shops that offer services that are complementary, and they give you more reasons to visit those stores than just buy things that perhaps you can do online. They were a bit further behind, so the reason digital has grown so much is because the amount of data you get, whereas stores for a lot of brands can be black boxes, where once the stock goes in, the visibility is not brilliant, and returns complicate that, and it's all a bit messy. So there are things that companies are doing. There's a brilliant startup that we worked with called Near Street, which is offering sort of online discovery for physical stores. Brilliant pitch, where they said, if you search for a white t-shirt online, you might see one in a warehouse 50 miles away and be able to order it in one click, but the one that's sort of maybe 400 meters down the road is invisible to you when you search online. So there are things you can do to make stores more visible, and companies are taking this sort of experimenting with the pandemic. So there was a fashion brand I spoke to who basically allowed customers searching online on their website to be connected to a local store colleague who could advise them on their collection, what was new in store. They could ask them what would match with an item of clothing, and they had kiosks in store to sort of facilitate that. So that's one example of stores being used differently. A children's brand. Oh, sorry, go on.
Well, I was going to say, what's the startup that you referenced, and I can put that in there.
It's called Near Street.
NEO Street.
NEARST.
Near Street. Awesome. Thank you.
No worries. And there's a children's wear brand who basically turned their stores. So they used to have expectant parents would come in and they'd say, I don't know what to do. I'm new at this. It's my first child, and they'd guide them through all the items when they need them, timelines, and then obviously sell them the items off the back of it. So they moved to a model where they basically did Zoom calls, and one store with one sort of colleague sort of demonstrating would get like 400 people, and suddenly, the cost, the effort, and the ROI on those sort of went up massively, and actually was a huge win for them in lockdown one. So I think people who are experimenting, the sort of innovation time cycles really shortened, and the store's definitely not dead. It just needs to be rethought slightly.
Okay, good.
Certainly, that's what we hope. One of the things that we are wondering, and from the data that you've seen, how are inflation and supply chain issues likely to affect retailers' margins this quarter?
It's incredibly challenging. So we were very heavily involved in the supply chain issues, and our lobbying was part of the reason that the government issued 5,000 extra temporary visas, even though that was very ideologically against the current government's sort of strategy, let's say. But supply chains were very tight. There were spot shortages. Inflation continues to rise, and that's a sort of global phenomenon. But there are some Brexit impacts. Whatever your politics may be. There were increased border checks introduced on Jan the 1st. A lot more border checks are coming in on July the 1st, and they've been pushed back 2 or 3 times by government now. And retail and generally sort of consumer businesses are doing all they can to prepare, but it will introduce more friction. It might introduce more cost. Retailers have absorbed as long as they could cost increases, particularly the grocers in 2009 when the first crunch happened. Essentially, everyone raised their prices, and the discounters came in and took massive chunks of market share. So that wasn't, from the grocery perspective, that wasn't going to happen again. But we're seeing it in other categories as well. So footwear, clothing has been deflationary for most of the pandemic, despite significant supply chain issues. The cost of a container from Asia has gone up from $1,000 to $10,000 in the space of sort of 12 to 18 months, and is not showing any sign of going down. So that's just one of a myriad of things: labor costs, shortage of HGV drivers that are sort of causing strain. I think it's a testament to our retail sector that actually nothing's fallen over yet. And now that Christmas is out the way, there was a real risk at Christmas that it didn't materialize in the end, but that there would be sort of shortages of key items, and that didn't happen. So we're not out of the woods yet. I think there's some Brexit hangovers we're going to have to deal with. That the effects remain uncertain. Costs are going to continue going up, and on the flip side of that, from a consumer perspective, everything's more expensive. So the energy price cap coming in in a few months' time, people's disposable incomes are going down, and that's tilted towards the sort of low, the lower income sort of decile quintiles of the nation. So it's going to be really challenging for some retailers, particularly in the sort of more value price points, to sort of mitigate that sort of reduction in demand.
Carl, dare I ask about that dreaded word that is Brexit? I mean, it's been a year since it's kind of, maybe even longer now with the pandemic in between, that we've been discussing it. But where are we at with it all? And are retailers confident about getting back into the EU?
So, I mean, EU. So in terms of sales, exports to the EU have definitely dropped. The complexity and red tape of shipping items out has become a lot more difficult. You've seen retailers sort of try and mitigate this by opening depots in Europe and countries they perhaps didn't have before, to try and sort of alleviate some of those stock and timing issues. It's had a few effects. So it had an effect on labor. So not just, I had a question from a reporter the other day saying, why have domestically produced vegetables prices gone up, but bananas and avocados and all the rest of it haven't? And I was like, well, picking, packing, all of that's done in the UK requires labor. A lot of that labor left during the lockdowns, and a lot of it didn't come back. So wages have risen. Wages have risen in domestic freight, whereas longer haul contracts have actually usually been negotiated well in advance and been hedged, and that's why those prices have gone up. So some interesting effects there from a labor perspective, and the HGV drivers was the most sort of famous of those. But we're also seeing in distribution lots of vacancies in stores as well. All that putting strain on retailers, and a lot of them are raising wages in response. But I think it'll be interesting to see what happens on July the 1st. We think retail's ready. In practice, we don't know exactly. It's been delayed several times because I think perhaps the government's concerned about its own preparedness in terms of the mountains of paperwork that are now going to be required to sort of sign a shipping container through a port. And we think retail's ready, but there'll always be companies that aren't, and that could cause some disruption down the line.
I'd hope to add to that, Kyle, and say that from the perspective of businesses we're talking to, I feel like there's a lot more interest in getting back into the EU, and there is quite a lot of hope that a year after these challenges, that there is a bit more possibility of getting things moving. So we have to be optimistic. We hope about that. In general, there's a lot of talk about omnichannel, and we know what you said before about strategies needing to be holistic. Are we seeing some retailers being winners and losers in the understanding what it means and how they're building a plan for it?
I definitely think so. So I think if you take the the worst hit categories, so say fashion, in lockdowns 1 through 3, not everyone was hit as badly as everyone else. So I think every company's on a digital journey, and some are right at the forefront, leading edge, and they might even describe themselves as a tech company disrupting the retail sector as opposed to a retailer in some instances. And some of our members do that. And those companies fared a lot better because it's ingrained in them to sort of constantly be improving, and they treat every problem as in a sort of agile development way, which brings benefits. So companies that are sort of further on the other end of the scale have struggled more, and they've had to invest more. And there's a lot of technical debt now sitting out there where people have just spun up huge projects in a very short space of time to sort of ensure their survival, and are now trying to work out how to sort of reduce that technical debt and sort of move forward in a sustainable way. So definite challenges. But I think as you say, there are pure plays moving into physical space. I was in Angel yesterday, and there was so I walked past the Amazon Fresh store. So there are companies going the other way. But in a time where footfall's down, the whole structure of the sort of commercial property behind that is probably going to be reviewed at some point, because the previously premium zone A commercial lets that had the highest footfall are now generally getting a lot less, as people sort of avoid busier thoroughfares, and people are localizing their spend a lot more. So some interesting things to come in the not too distant future.
Can I just ask you to explain what you mean by technical debt? I don't know if you've heard that expression, Nathan. It's not something I've heard before in terms of retailers investing in, I'm assuming, digital and analytics. Could you just unpack what that means?
Yeah, absolutely. So in essence, we were speaking with a consultancy that we work with, and one of the our IT community, and one of the challenges that they face is in essence a bit like a store portfolio. If you expand aggressively and you've got lots of stores, and then sort of the market contracts and demand's lower in some of those, and you have to rationalize that portfolio. It can be like that with development, and you'll hire more developers, you'll spend more on sort of things that become core, or projects that aren't quite so core of your online offering, and then you have to sort of and people, because everything shifted online for non-food, a lot of non-food brands and retailers spent a lot in a very short space of time, and now they're trying to sort of manage back. Now that sort of normality's resumed, and it can be quite tricky to unpick, in the same way that offloading a store when you've got long-term leases is not particularly easy. There's the same challenges for online.
That's really helpful. Thanks for that.
No worries.
I've got a question. Obviously, e-commerce has boomed, particularly over the pandemic, and before that. I mean, there's increasing competition for warehouse space and storage in the UK. It's not just the traditional challenges you'd expect with e-com, but all the knock-on challenges. Who's going to be the winners and losers in this kind of ops war, if you like?
That's a very good question, and it's a tricky one to answer as well, because it's not very clear cut. I think there is a sort of the bigger players have got an advantage. If you look at one of the large sort of multi-category digital department stores, if you want to call them that we work with, they opened a huge Amazon-esque automated distribution center near Peterborough just before the pandemic hit, and obviously that's reaped them huge dividends. I think for those that can't afford that level of sort of sophistication and are sort of renting, leasing spaces or whatever it might be, it does pose challenges, because obviously that has knock-on effects on distribution time, on visibility of stock, on efficiency, and it sort of reduces the experience of shopping online. So consumers gave retail a lot of leeway. One department store had, I think, it had 10-day lead time just before Christmas for orders, which they advertised on their website because they had to, due to supply chain issues. But people are becoming more discerning in ther shopping habits, and I guess less tolerant, I think, of some of this disruption. So things like short delivery times and stock availability and all the rest of it are a lot more important than they were perhaps 12 months ago.
That's really interesting, because the question that we had considered is, what role do you think technology has to play in retail, or do we need to focus more on customer service and improve buying experiences? And that talks really to that problem that you just outlined.
It's definitely both. I think retail is, to me, people and technology. It's experience, it's intuition, it's as you say, that customer experience. There are things that before the pandemic, 80% of our spend was in stores. We like to shop in stores as a nation. And they serve more roles than just selling things. There's expertise, there's the social element, there's a lot to it, and people are absolutely core to that. And we, as the BRC, have our own sort of training and learning platform, and we take that very seriously in terms of keeping that afloat. But then the other side is technology enabling that, and in some places trying to mimic or enhance or improve on the sort of the people side of things.
Carl, one thing I've loved about the lockdown, I guess, is the increased use of independent stores and local businesses, and people buying local and perhaps going, I'm going to use the local business as opposed to going to the national chain. Do you see this trend continuing as we go for a more sustainable, conscious consumer life, or do you think actually we'll soon revert back to that convenience model where we'll just get it all from one store because then I don't have to go to individual stores, etc.?
We're definitely seeing a lot more fragmentation and specialization. So people going to a specialist in a particular category and getting their sort of items from there instead of going for the all-in-one. But it's a mixture across the piece, and obviously price is quite important. With sustainability, so we're about to launch the latest wave of our sort of future consumer index, and some interesting findings. So one of the findings was that the planet first segment, so the people sort of very interested in sort of sustainability and the wider constellation of things that means, have essentially become the largest segment. So now that the sort of most of the concern over the pandemic is waning, we're sort of getting to the point with Omicron where it seems that it isn't the worst case where we're going to go back into sort of lockdowns, and so confidence is resuming slightly. That actually the sort of provenance of items, and tied to that is things like carbon usage and shopping locally, and being a more buying better, not buying more. All those sort of concepts came to the fore and were quite clear. So I think where the challenge is, unfortunately, is that there is definitely a disconnect. So the same people who said all those things in this survey, in the same breath said, I think 75% of them said, yes, but I'm not willing to pay a premium for it. So I think a bit of a disconnect there. So the intention's good. It's just the execution that we're sort of struggling with as a nation. And it does pose a challenge for retailers, obviously, with mounting costs. How do you sort of be green without adding more cost on top?
We've just had a comment from Thomas Panton, who said great news regarding climate conscious shopping. So we've got some people that are encouraged by what you're saying. In that broader category, how are retailers dealing with these challenging consumer expectations while staying profitable in the terms of sustainability?
It's a good question. So, I mean, selfless plug for the BRC, but we have got our own climate action roadmap, and we've got a lot of the large Tesco's recently joined, and we've got I think close to 100 now brands who have signed a pledge, which has sort of 4 tracks, from transparency to better working conditions to to reducing carbon and water usage, not just in their stores and distribution centers, but all the way back through their supply chain. So there's sort of action at the top end happening. And I think, and brands lower down who perhaps haven't got the sort of where the impact of a single smaller brand doing something is less than someone who employs 500,000 people. There's lots being done at that end as well, and it is becoming a sort of significant differentiator in people's offering. I think if you can get them land the message, and it's very hard. If you take Body Shop, who plaster their CSR credentials over everything that they do, not everyone knows surveyed when they went out to market that's actually one of the sort of USPs of Body Shop still, despite all that. So for a company coming in fresh or starting from scratch, it is a lot harder. But it is on a lot of people's minds, and not just from a sort of altruistic perspective, but I think further up the sort of food chain, your sort of investors, your private equity, ESG credentials are becoming increasingly important in terms of investment portfolios. So actually there's sort of top-down pressure from investors to actually for companies to become greener because they think it'll make them more money. Whatever the reason.
So it's not just the retailers need to deal with changing consumer expectations and worry about being profitable. Investors are expecting them to be more profitable if they are dealing with the sustainability and corporate social responsibility in the sector.
There's an expectation, maintaining growth while sort of in the background making changes that sort of increase their social sort of responsibility obligations. So yeah, it's coming from both sides, which is good for all of us. I think.
Hopefully it's a win-win for everybody, right?
Absolutely.
Folks, I'm just going to come to a LinkedIn question. Before I do, just a quick shout out to Thomas Panton, who I know commented earlier, and again, with his focus on the greener, one of the world's first kind of sustainable marketplaces, obviously the climate roadmap is going to be of huge interest to him and businesses alike. So Thomas, well worth checking out that. I see Heloise has kindly put that in the comments. Let's come to Lewis Goodall's comments. It says, "Hi everyone. The Gymshark store has been of interest of mine for a while along Regent Street. Over the pandemic, high streets have had mixed footfall results and seen more activity online. Do you think that as consumers, we can see more of an interest in high street consumerism in the coming years? I'd like to know your opinion about Gymshark's bricks and mortar store plan. And as we're talking about Gymshark, also a shout out to Blakely Clothing, who have also taken that bricks and mortar plunge with their first retail store in Norwich.
It's a really good question, Lewis. So I think it's interesting because at Gymshark, their strategy historically has been online first and then build through social and through pop-ups and event, a sort of following, a loyal following within the community that they serve, which is obviously the fitness community. So I think, people, if I used to actually do the sort of insight for the West End, including Regent Street, and brands that come in there generally are trying to it's their flagship. So it's like it's more than just a store. It is the sort of embodiment of what their brand is, and they will do exciting things. Whether it's Lululemon having gym, yoga studio, free yoga studio upstairs that they'd have week classes at. Microsoft for their immersive store. The list goes on. So I think opening a store on Regent Street is usually, or Oxford Street or Bond Street is usually a sort of first step for a brand. Testing the waters and sort of playing with some concepts. But yeah, I think it's going to be a sort of a year of correction for physical retail. I think it was overdue it. So we're unique as a country where we've had this system of upward only rent reviews for as long as I can remember. I think private equity sort of came in and sort of inflated prices, and it made it very hard for a lot of companies to move in, or very costly. And you're looking at 10-year leases. All that's changing. So the pandemic has meant a lot of retailers, a lot of property owners are looking at sort of turnover-based rents, which is a new concept for many. There's been some support on the sort of business rate side, and the government are sort of they're not adjusting them as it stands, but values will change with the rent moratorium ending and other pieces coming into place. So yeah, it's exciting. I think I love seeing new store concepts and seeing what brands bring to the party, and yeah, no more so than on Regent Street.
Should we delve into another question there, Nathan?
Yes, I see another's come up online from Harsh Better. Hey, Harsh. His question is, what are your thoughts on channels such as WhatsApp and Instagram that are now double up as additional channels that retailers can use to build commerce journeys?
So I think something I should have clarified on when I said that we live in a post-channel world. I didn't actually explain what I really meant by that very well, which is essentially consumers just want to buy wherever is most convenient for them now. They won't necessarily wait or defer. They just want in the easiest possible way for them. And there will inevitably be some customers who prefer WhatsApp or Instagram. If you spend 3/4 of your day browsing Instagram and a nice shirt pops up, of course, being able to buy it in several clicks is an optimum experience for you, rather than having to click on a button, go to a website, check if it's in stock, go to a store if it's not. So WhatsApp's interesting. Obviously, WeChat in China has been absolutely huge and is fundamental to the sort of functioning of their economy. WhatsApp commerce, could serve a similar purpose with certain niches to start with. It's and there are lots of companies adopting already. There's certain luxury brands who I forget the name of it now, but there's one luxury brand company which basically does all its business through WhatsApp, and it's a personally tailored service because that's what their customers want. They want to speak to someone on the end of a real person, have that sort of tangible advice back and forth before they buy. So yeah, very possible that will and very probable that will become a core part of people's offer going forward.
Awesome, thanks for that.
I'll come back to the questions that we got in before the show. One of the questions we got asked, Scott, is we've lost some massive names from the high street over the last 3, 4, 5 years. Are we going to go through another period of transition, or will we see other big brands struggle in the next few years?
It's a good question, and it's quite a somber one. We lost lots of colleagues over the last few years. Some of that is through mismanagement by the sort of parent companies. Some of it is through market forces, or them not adapting quickly enough. I think the players that we've lost, the sort of the large ones, I think it was an inevitability that wasn't necessarily just bad luck. And I think the one constant in retail is change. There's always new players coming in. There's always someone who's hungrier, leaner, smaller, and the large players have to fight quite hard to sort of maintain competitive advantage in that. And it's never been easier to enter, with the likes of sort of Shopify, WooCommerce, you can spin up, and Square and all the rest of it, you can spin up a pop-up shop with an online presence in next to no time now and start selling things. So, and also supply chains are a lot more transparent. There's a lot more choice, and actually wholesaling is a lot easier. So, I think there's lots of opportunity there.
It's interesting. We were talking just before we came on air about the FSB report that came out today about consumer confidence and about business confidence. So the question of whether we're going to see big brands struggle, or actually we're just going to perhaps see a reshift between some more on the up and some more on the down. Perhaps we don't have to. It's not a black or white answer, right?
It's challenging. So I think there's a lot of imbalance in the market at the moment. So that the pandemic has sort of forced some behavior changes which have stuck, and it's accelerated others. So the shift to online is an acceleration. The sort of home centricity has been forced but stuck, and hybrid working now is probably just the normal for people that can do it. But that leads to interesting challenges for retailers, because suddenly people can have parcels, like everything, delivered on the days that they're at home, instead of going to a pickup locker in town, or instead of popping out after work. So there's lots of sort of small structural changes that add up to sort of big fundamental changes. And it is difficult online to it can be more challenging for small players to compete, in the sense that Google ad space costs money in the same way a sort of prime rental space costs a lot of money on a store. But if you're competing for a high volume AdWord, it's going to cost you lots of cash, and small players can compete less easily. There are pros and cons, in the sense that localization piece and people being more, buying better and thinking about the sort of provenance of their purchase means that small companies that are more agile can do that quite quickly, and sort of capitalize on those trends perhaps faster than a larger business can. So yeah, it's an interesting question. I think we're not out of the woods. I think next year is going to be a very probably a challenging one for lots of retailers.
Thanks for that. There's a question here from Rahab. With growth of digital shopping, how important will the multi-carrier delivery strategies become? How will the new players in the market, like Amazon, change the landscape for legacy carriers?
That is a good question, and one that I probably am not best placed to answer, but I'll do my best. So I think it's, by carrier, I assume you mean sort of last mile delivery, and I think there's been some challenges around. So post office at the moment is in the news because it's laying off staff. You've got other large delivery freight firms saying that they're increasing their fleet, and they're sort of widening their capacity. I think there's a rationalization that needs to be done. I did a study when I was in London saying that I think 60 or 70% of the traffic that went down Bond Street on a given day was delivery vehicles. That's
insane. 60 to 70% of traffic down Bond Street was delivery vehicles. Wow, that tells us a lot.
And there was lots of work being done in cities to rationalize that. So I think they built a depot sort of on the outskirts of London, and then they used an e-fleet to try and aggregate deliveries using data. It was quite an interesting project, but I think that sort of that last mile piece is quite an interesting one, and not one that we've answered, because I think as digital continues to grow, which it no doubt will, and there's already talk of packaging waste, and if it's the most efficient way to do things. So tied in with that sustainability piece is a question around which is the most sustainable way of shopping. If you ask your average consumer, I don't think they'd probably be able to tell you. Anyway.
That's fascinating insight. As we look to come towards the end of today's session, I just want to give a final shout out to anyone out there that would like to ask a question. Incredible opportunity to speak with Carl and to hear his insight. But yeah, thank you all so much for joining us today. Before we look to wrap up, last chance for some questions. And Heloise, I believe you've got one final question to end today's session.
Kyle, you have a fantastic perspective on all sorts of areas of the retail landscape. And I'm sure on one hand, you're just an observer, but on the other hand, if you had a magic wand, what changes would you seek to make to the retail landscape right now in the UK?
Oh, that's a big one. So, I mean, I think the way that we view, the cost burden on physical. So part of the reason why digital is thriving is because there's an unfair cost burden on stores, in my perception. I think the business rates tax system is pretty broken. It's a huge cost burden, and the retail sector, is 5% of GVA, but it pays 10% of business taxes and 25% of business rates. So huge contributor, but it's also stifling innovation in physical space and making the barrier to entry far too high. So I would reduce all that and hope that it would sort of be a new dawn for like high streets up and down the country. You'd have much wider usage, more interesting stores, and people and companies doing more interesting things with the space that they take. So that would be my vision for the future.
Folks, any final questions? If not, we'll wrap up. Just Kyle, a massive personal thank you, both from Heloise and I, for today. Heloise and I have set out on this journey, or quest, if you like, to bring the brightest minds in retail to our LinkedIn audience to try and share insight, knowledge, and wisdom. And you've done that absolutely perfectly. So massive thank you, Kyle. Huge shout out to the British Retail Consortium and all the great work that you guys are doing. We hope to get you back on the show perhaps later in the year to see how things have changed and what's evolved since this session. But for now, a massive thank you for those that have joined us. Thank you so much. Please do look out and sign up for our next LinkedIn Live, which is on the 24th of February at 12:30. We'll be joined by the head of retail from KPMG, Mr. Paul Martin. We look forward to seeing you all next time. Thank you so much. If you do have other questions, please do add them to the LinkedIn invite. We'll be happy to try and get back to you. But for now, from Heloise, from Carl and I, a massive thank you, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.